The day my family invited me to dinner, I knew something felt strange. We had not spent much time together in months, and they were never the type to invite me just because they missed me. Still, I accepted because a small part of me hoped things had changed. I thought maybe we could enjoy one peaceful evening together. I could not have been more wrong. From the moment I walked into the restaurant, I could feel the way they looked at me. My sister smiled, but it did not feel warm. My brother asked if I was still driving that old thing, talking about my SUV like it was a joke. Someone laughed and said they hoped the menu had something I could afford. Everyone at the table chuckled except me. They thought I did not notice the quiet comments and the little looks they gave each other, but I noticed every single one. That I kept my smile on my face because I had learned a long time ago that defending myself never changed their minds. The more I explained my choices, the more they judged me. So I simply ordered my meal, answered their questions with short replies, and let them believe whatever they wanted. They thought my simple clothes meant I was struggling. They believed my old SUV was proof that I had failed in life. They assumed that because I never talked about money, I did not have any. They had created a story about me in their minds, and nothing I said would have changed it. What they never understood was that I had stopped trying to impress people years ago. After losing my husband, I learned that peace was worth more than showing off. I focused on my work, lived below my means, and built my life one step at a time. I did not need expensive things to prove my success. After dinner, my sister suggested we all stop by the bank because she had some paperwork she needed to handle before it closed. Everyone agreed, and I quietly went along. They had no idea that walking into that building would change the entire evening. The moment we stepped inside, everything shifted. Before I even reached the front counter, the branch manager looked up, smiled, and walked straight toward me. He greeted me by name with genuine respect and reached out to shake my hand. The room suddenly became silent. I turned toward my family, and for the first time that evening, none of them had anything to say. That awkward moment at the bank did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of being treated like I did not matter. My family had already decided who I was, and they never cared enough to learn the truth. My older sister, Brenna, loved making little comments that sounded harmless, but were meant to embarrass me. If I wore the same coat for a few winters, she would ask if I needed a shopping trip. If I brought a homemade dish to family dinners, she would joke that I was trying to save money. My younger brother, Dashiell, was no different. He liked comparing his new purchases with my simple lifestyle. He would talk about expensive vacations, new cars, and designer furniture while looking at me, waiting for a reaction. I rarely gave him one. The hardest part was watching my parents say nothing. My father, Lowell, always stayed quiet. He would look down at his plate or change the subject. He never defended me, even when he knew the jokes had gone too far. My mother, Maris, acted as if she cared, but her kindness never felt real. She often said things like, "We should all help Corinne if she's having a hard time." She spoke with pity, not love. She wanted everyone to believe she was being generous, even though I had never asked any of them for a single dollar. Over time, I stopped expecting respect from them. I attended birthdays, holiday dinners, and family celebrations because I wanted to keep the peace. I smiled, listened, and left without complaining. Deep inside, their words still hurt, but I refused to let them see it. A few weeks later, Brenna called the family with an announcement. Our late grandmother's house was finally being sold, and everyone needed to meet to sign the last of the legal paperwork. She spoke like she was doing everyone a favor by organizing it. Before ending the call, she said we should all stop by the bank afterward because there were a few financial documents connected to the sale. Something about her voice told me this meeting was about more than paperwork. Later, I learned that Brenna and Dashiell had already convinced themselves I would struggle to pay my share of the legal expenses. They quietly expected me to admit I could not afford everything. They even believed I might ask the family for a loan. They were so confident in their assumptions that they had already planned how they would respond. I listened without correcting anyone. There was no reason to ruin their expectations. I agreed to meet them on the scheduled day, knowing exactly what was waiting for us once we walked through the bank doors. The morning of the meeting arrived, and I got ready without feeling nervous. I wore a simple navy blue outfit and carried the same leather folder I always used for important documents. There was nothing special about the way I looked, and I preferred it that way. I had learned that people often underestimated those who did not try to impress them. When I reached the lawyer's office, everyone else was already there. The paperwork for my grandmother's house was waiting on the table. The meeting itself was straightforward. The lawyer explained the final documents, answered a few questions, and asked each of us to sign where needed. I carefully read every page before writing my name. The others seemed eager to finish as quickly as possible. Once the documents were signed, Brenna stood up with a smile and reminded everyone that the bank was our next stop. She acted as though it was just another small task before the day was over. Nobody questioned her plan, so we all walked out together. On the way there, the conversation stayed focused on money. Brenna talked about how expensive legal matters could become. Dashiell mentioned unexpected bills that always appeared after selling property. They spoke loudly enough for me to hear every word. It felt less like a conversation and more like they were waiting for me to react. I stayed quiet and looked out the window. A few minutes later, Brenna turned toward me with a polite smile that did not feel sincere. "Everything should be manageable for you, right?" she asked. I looked at her and simply answered, "I'm not worried." She raised her eyebrows but did not say anything else. When we arrived at the bank, everyone parked together and walked toward the entrance. My family seemed relaxed, almost excited. They looked at one another as if they were expecting something interesting to happen inside. I could almost guess what they were thinking. They believed this would be the moment I admitted I could not handle my financial responsibilities. What they did not realize was that I had visited this branch many times before. I knew the building well. I knew several employees by name. I also knew exactly why I needed to be there that afternoon, but I had never shared those details with anyone in my family because my personal finances were nobody else's business. As we reached the front doors, I took a slow breath and followed everyone inside. I had no reason to feel anxious because I wasn't hiding any problems. The only people carrying false expectations were the ones walking beside me. In just a few moments, those expectations were about to fall apart in a way none of them could have imagined. As soon as we stepped into the lobby, I noticed the branch manager looking in my direction. His face lit up with a smile, and he immediately walked over before anyone had the chance to speak. "Good afternoon, Ms. Hale," he said warmly as he reached out to shake my hand. "It's wonderful to see you again. I wasn't expecting you today." "It's good to see you too," I replied with a smile. "I've already prepared everything you requested," he said. "If you have a few minutes, we can go over it in my office." I nodded. "That sounds perfect." For a moment, nobody around me said a word. My family had stopped walking. Brenna looked from me to the branch manager with a confused expression. Dashiell frowned as if he thought he had heard the wrong name. My parents stood quietly behind them, clearly surprised by what they were seeing. The manager politely turned toward the rest of my family. "Please make yourselves comfortable," he said. "Ms. Hale won't be long." Then he led me down the hallway toward one of the private offices. As we walked, several employees smiled and greeted me. "Good to see you again, Ms. Hale. Welcome back. I hope you've been doing well." I greeted each of them by name. They had always treated me with kindness and professionalism, and I appreciated that. Behind us, I could feel my family's eyes following every step. Inside the office, the manager closed the door and offered me a seat. "I've gathered the files you asked for," he said as he placed a folder on the desk. "Everything is ready for your review." "Thank you," I answered. "I appreciate how quickly your team handled everything." "It's always a pleasure working with you," he replied. While we began looking through the documents, I could still picture the expressions on my family's faces. They had walked into the bank expecting to watch me struggle. Instead, they had watched the staff treat me like a respected client they already knew well. Outside the office, I later learned that Brenna could not stop asking questions. She quietly asked one of the employees if they knew me. The employee simply smiled and answered, "Ms. Hale has been one of our valued clients for years." That single sentence only made everyone more confused. Nothing they had expected was happening. The picture they had created of my life no longer made sense. They had believed they knew everything about me because of the way I lived. Now they were realizing they had never actually known me at all, and the answers they wanted were waiting just beyond the closed office door. Inside the office, the atmosphere slowly shifted as the manager opened the files and began explaining everything in detail. The documents on the desk were not simple bank forms or loan papers like my family might have expected. Instead, they included long-term investment portfolios, trust agreements, and financial records that showed years of careful planning. I listened quietly as the manager spoke with respect, pointing out updates and confirming recent decisions that had been made under my name. My family stood nearby, watching every page turn, trying to understand what they were seeing, but clearly struggling to connect it with the image they had built in their minds. The manager continued speaking in a calm and professional tone, explaining how different accounts were structured and how certain funds had been allocated to long-term projects. He mentioned that some of these accounts were linked to community programs I had supported over the years, including local scholarships for students who needed financial help and support funds for families of veterans. His voice carried no surprise, only steady respect, as if all of this was normal to him. My siblings exchanged quick looks, their confidence from earlier slowly fading. Brenna no longer had her usual expression of control, and Dashiell stopped smirking entirely. The idea they had carried for so long, that I was struggling or dependent on others, was breaking apart with every sentence the manager spoke. When he thanked me for my continued trust in their bank and acknowledged my consistent support for community causes, the words landed heavily in the room. It became clear that I was not there to ask for help or approval. I was there as someone whose financial decisions had already been guiding significant resources for years. My family's silence grew stronger as the reality settled in. Every small insult, every joke about my lifestyle, and every assumption they had made about my success suddenly felt louder in their minds. The way they had spoken to me before, the way they had dismissed my choices, and the way they had believed I had nothing of value all came back to them at once. None of them spoke, but their faces showed the shift clearly. Confusion turned into shock, and shock slowly turned into discomfort. The room felt smaller as the truth continued to unfold without drama or emotion, only facts presented calmly by the manager. I stayed quiet, letting everything speak for itself, knowing that sometimes the truth does not need to be defended, only revealed. The silence in the room did not last long. As soon as the initial shock started to settle, my family's behavior began to change in a way that felt almost immediate. Brenna was the first to speak again, but her tone was completely different from before. She tried to smile, stepping slightly closer as if distance no longer mattered. Dashiell followed quickly, his earlier confidence gone, replaced with a nervous expression he rarely showed. Even my parents, who had stayed quiet for most of the time, suddenly seemed more alert and attentive, as if they were carefully choosing every word. Brenna started by saying my name softly, then added words about how important family always was. She spoke as if nothing from earlier in the day had happened. Dashiell quickly joined in, bringing up old memories from childhood and trying to sound warm and friendly. He mentioned how he had always looked up to me, even though his voice did not match his words. My mother also stepped forward, saying she had always known I would do well in life, even though she had never shown that belief before. My father nodded quietly beside her, adding only a few words, but his tone now carried a strange level of approval. What changed most was not what they said, but how they said it. The same people who had treated me with doubt and distance now spoke, as if I was someone they had always supported. The shift was too clear to ignore. I could see how quickly their attitude had adjusted once they understood the truth about my situation. I listened carefully without interrupting. Every apology and every kind word felt carefully chosen, like they were trying to correct something important, but without fully admitting what had been wrong. They were not looking back at their behavior. They were focused on what they had misunderstood. Brenna reached out slightly as she spoke again, saying she hoped we could move forward as a family. Dashiell added that he was sorry for any misunderstandings, but he avoided mentioning the things he had actually said in the past. My parents repeated similar words, expressing pride and support that felt new and untested. I gave a calm response, accepting their words without argument. I did not raise my voice or show anger, but I also did not return the warmth they were offering. Something inside me had already understood the difference between real regret and sudden interest. Standing there, I realized their apologies were not about the past. They were about the present situation and what they thought I could offer now. That understanding stayed with me as I continued listening, knowing that trust is not rebuilt just because words are spoken in a different tone. Everything changed after that day in the bank, but not in the way my family thought it would. Instead of stepping back and reflecting, they began to act like I had suddenly become the solution to every problem they had ever ignored. Their tone toward me grew softer, but their intentions became more direct. Brenna was the first to approach me privately. She spoke carefully, choosing her words as if she had been planning them for a long time. She talked about her husband's business and how difficult things had become recently. At first, she made it sound like she was only sharing a concern, but it quickly became clear she wanted more than just advice. She hinted that an investment from me could save everything and help the business grow again. Her eyes stayed fixed on me, watching for any sign that I might agree. Dashiell was not far behind her. He avoided looking directly at me when he spoke, but his voice carried urgency. He admitted he had made mistakes in the past, but he quickly shifted the conversation toward his current situation. He mentioned debts in a vague way at first, then slowly revealed how serious things had become. It was clear he had been struggling for a long time without telling anyone. What he truly wanted was help clearing everything before it became worse. He framed it as a temporary setback, but the truth behind it felt much heavier. My parents joined in soon after. They did not ask for anything directly at first. Instead, they spoke about family unity and how important it was to support one another in difficult times. They said things like, "We should stay together," and "family takes care of family," but their meaning was obvious. They expected me to step in and handle the financial weight of everyone's problems. They spoke as if it was the natural role for me to take. As I listened to all of them, I stayed quiet for a long time. I watched how quickly their concern for me had turned into expectation. Not a single one of them asked how I felt or what I wanted. Every conversation circled back to money, as if that was the only thing that mattered now. In that moment, something inside me became very clear. It was not anger, but understanding. I could see that their interest in me was not new. It had only changed shape. The same people who once dismissed my life were now depending on it. I realized then that money had not changed who I was. It had only revealed who they had always been when they thought I had nothing to offer. I did not raise my voice or argue with anyone. I simply listened to everything they had to say, letting their words settle in the room. When they finally stopped speaking, expecting an answer from me, I took a moment before responding. There was no rush anymore, no pressure to agree or disagree with their demands. I told them calmly that the decisions they were talking about had already been made. My voice stayed steady as I explained that my financial plans were not something open for discussion at this point. Everything had been organized in advance, carefully and clearly, without confusion or delay. I made it clear that these were not new choices and not something I was deciding in that moment. As I spoke, I could see their expressions begin to change again. The confidence they had earlier started to fade, replaced with confusion and disbelief. They had assumed there was still room to influence my decisions, but that was not the case. I continued speaking without emotion, explaining that my long-term plans had already been structured and finalized months earlier. Nothing they were asking for had been included in those arrangements. I also explained that the money I had worked for was not going to be divided the way they expected. Instead of being distributed among family members based on personal requests, it had already been directed toward specific purposes that were meaningful to me. I mentioned support for educational scholarships, funding for small business development, and programs designed to help widows rebuild their lives after loss. These were not random choices, but decisions shaped by my own experiences and values. As I spoke, I watched their reactions closely. Brenna looked like she wanted to interrupt but did not. Dashiell lowered his eyes, avoiding the conversation completely. My parents stood still, as if trying to process what they were hearing. None of them had expected that I would have already taken full control of my future decisions without involving anyone else. I did not say any of this to hurt them. I said it because it was the truth, and they needed to understand it. There was no anger in my tone, only clarity. I had no desire to continue the cycle of expectation and disappointment that had been building between us. When I finished speaking, the room became quiet again. This time, the silence felt different. It was no longer confusion about who I was. It was the realization that they had already lost the chance to shape what came next. After that conversation, things slowly began to fall apart in ways that could no longer be ignored. The first signs showed up in Brenna's situation. The business she had been depending on started struggling more than before. Without additional support, she could not keep things stable. Expenses kept growing, but the expected help she had been counting on never came. Over time, she had to reduce staff and cut back operations until there was almost nothing left of what she had built. The confidence she once carried turned into stress and frustration. Dashiell's situation became difficult in a different way. The pressure he had been avoiding for years finally caught up with him. The debts he had kept hidden could no longer be ignored or delayed. He was forced to deal with them directly, without anyone stepping in to fix things for him. The responsibility weighed heavily on him, and for the first time, he had to face the consequences of his own decisions without relying on family support. It was not easy, and there were moments when he struggled to keep control of everything. My parents watched all of this happen, but by then, it was too late for them to change anything. They began to realize that the way they had treated me over the years had created distance that could not be easily repaired. Their focus on one child while overlooking another had slowly damaged the bond within the family. What once felt normal to them now looked like a series of missed chances and unspoken regrets. I saw them differently during this time, not as people demanding something from me, but as individuals dealing with the results of their own choices. There was no satisfaction in watching their struggles, only a quiet understanding that every action eventually leads somewhere. For the first time in a long while, I stopped attending family gatherings. No one questioned me directly, and I did not feel the need to explain my absence. It felt different not being in those rooms where I had once tried so hard to fit in. Instead of feeling pressure to please everyone, I felt a sense of calm that I had not experienced before. I chose to focus on my own life without the constant weight of expectation. There was no anger guiding that decision, only clarity. I no longer needed approval to feel steady in my own choices. Walking away did not feel like loss. It felt like finally breathing without restraint, and that peace was something I had been missing for a very long time. Months passed, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm for me. The days were quieter, but in a good way. I spent my time around people who treated me with respect without needing any explanation. My circle became smaller, but it felt more honest. The people around me were co-workers who valued my work, friends who listened without judgment, and individuals who saw me for who I was rather than what they thought I had. Work became something I looked forward to again. There was no pressure to prove myself in ways that had nothing to do with my abilities. I could focus fully on what I was building, without distractions from expectations that never truly belonged to me. Every decision I made felt lighter, as if I was finally moving at my own pace instead of being pulled in different directions by other people's opinions. With time, I understood things more clearly than before. I realized that staying quiet in difficult situations was never a sign of weakness. It was often a way of protecting my peace when speaking would only create more conflict. I also learned that living simply does not mean living without success. True stability does not always need attention or validation from others. One of the biggest lessons I carried with me was that real success does not need to be announced or displayed. It does not depend on approval, and it does not grow from comparison. It is something built quietly, step by step, through patience and consistency. Once I understood that, I stopped feeling the need to explain my life to anyone who had already decided what they wanted to believe. Over time, I heard small updates about my family, but they felt distant now. They were dealing with their own lives and challenges, and I was no longer part of that cycle. There was no anger left when I thought about them, only acceptance that things had unfolded the way they had. What stayed with me most was the understanding that relationships are not defined by blood alone. They are shaped by respect, trust, and the way people treat each other when it matters most. Without those things, even the closest connections can slowly fall apart. I also came to see something else very clearly. The people who once looked down on me had not lost anything material because of me. What they lost was something far more meaningful. They lost access to someone who once cared deeply about their approval. In the end, I understood that revenge was never about proving anything to others. It was about choosing a life where I no longer needed to be understood by people who refused to see me clearly. That choice gave me a kind of peace that no argument or explanation ever could.